There's something else I wanted to ask you two. What was it? Oh, yeah. Don't you two have any brains?
Montu.
We don't need.
Brains.
Not as long as we have our.
Corvettes.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. That's really something.
Corvette spam or battleships? Let's dive in and find out. What are we looking at? Well, we're going to have fleets of battleships fighting fleets of corvettes. Each fleet is going to be comprised entirely of ships of the same design. Now I've got 2 designs for my corvettes and 3 designs for my battleships, and we'll look at those in a minute. Each fleet is going to be made up of the same fleet capacity worth of ships. In the majority of these tests, that's been 10 battleships against 80 corvettes. And we're going to look at the losses each fleet takes as a percentage of their overall fleet size, as well as keeping in mind which fleet was forced to retreat and lost the battle. Let's start at the beginning and let's look at some ship designs. As battleships is a technology you won't be getting until quite a bit later on in the game, I'm going to be looking at these ship designs from the point of view of someone who's unlocked basically all the technology. We're going to be allowing the best weapons on our ships and getting the best combat computers we can, etc, etc. Now, the only thing I won't be doing is taking the psionic combat computers. I will be going for the synthetic ones. And I am assuming that in your game you've had access to crystalline hull plating, because by this point either it doesn't exist in the galaxy or you've got hold of it and you can produce it. So here is the first one. This is our torpedo corvette. Now we've got the best torpedoes and we've got the best autocannons we can get. I've gone for a mixture of hull plating, armor and shields. And then on top of that I've gone for the afterburners, the advanced one. That's boosted our evasion to 90% along with the drive that we've got. So I haven't needed to take the swarm combat computer. Instead I've gone for the picket combat computer just to boost my tracking a bit. That doesn't really matter in this engagement because our battleships should have very low evasion anyway. And here's the second Corvette design. This is our gunboat Corvette. Now this one's basically the same except I've got 3 small slots. On it I put 2 autocannons and a plasma cannon. Basically that's going to allow the ship to deal with both shields, armor and hull effectively. And that's my 2 Corvette designs. So let's look at some battleships. Well, the first battleship we're going to look at is the artillery battleship. Now I put the spinal mount on this. You should always put the spinal mount on. It's going to be better than pretty much any other weapon you can fit on the front of here. I did actually test that out by briefly running some battleships with just 2 large slots on the front. But if you look at the stats on your neutron launchers, you're going to see that your spinal mount will fire just as often as 2 neutron launchers, but overall deal a lot more damage. So here we've got, again, a mixture of hull, armor and shields. I've gone for the extra tracking module on this one, just to boost our tracking against the corvettes. Otherwise, I've also gone for the artillery combat computer as well. This is a pretty standard artillery battleship. Next, we're going to look at a carrier battleship. Now, this one I've replaced the core module with a carrier core that's given me 2 fighter bays. I'm also going to throw in a couple of autocannons there. The autocannon is going to be a more effective weapon at dealing with these corvettes than any of the other options I could choose. I've also gone for the anti-missile point defense because I'm definitely not coming up against fighters and sometimes they're going to have missiles. And finally, a bit of a weird one. This is going to be a line battleship just to test it out. I've gone with the hangar core for extra medium weapons and also for one of those fighter modules. Otherwise, it's pretty similar to the other 2 battleship designs again, but I've also gone for a broadside stern just to get more weapons on there, get a higher fire rate, and get things with high tracking so we can hopefully hit these corvettes. So let's look at some results, starting with the mainstay of any late game fleet, the artillery battleship. Now, the artillery battleship lost all of its engagements against both the gunboat corvettes and the torpedo corvettes overall. Now, how did these engagements work? Well, I engaged 1 fleet of battleships against the fleet of corvettes, and then as soon as it was possible to retreat, I looked at how many ships were alive, and then I let the fight continue to the full length. I also re-engaged with the same fleet with both a trickster admiral on both sides and the war doctrine hit and run, just so we can get maximum bonus to our disengagement chance for all ships, and that's what's noted where you see the war doctrine written down. It's always the hit and run war doctrine. So, which was more powerful of the two types of corvettes though? Well, as you can see here clearly, in the initial engagements, the torpedo corvettes caused many more losses to the battleship fleets. However, as the engagement continued, the losses tended to be pretty even Steven. So if you engage a fleet of corvettes with battleships, you are going to lose the engagement, but it doesn't really matter if they are torpedo corvettes or they're gunboat corvettes, the interceptor corvettes. Either way, you're going to get roughly the same number of losses overall. But if you are engaging gunboat corvettes, it's probably ideal to disengage from that combat as soon as you can. Something to note really about this data though, if you notice, the artillery battleships consistently destroy more corvettes than they take in losses, unless you let the engagement run to full and you don't have the war doctrine and the trickster admiral on. If you have the war doctrine, the hit and run doctrine and trickster admiral, you are going to be dealing a lot more damage than you'll be taking with this fleet. As long as you can repair your battleships and then re-engage in a long war of attrition, the corvettes are actually really not the way to go against battleships. In a defensive situation, you can use corvettes to repel a battleship fleet that's trying to take a system, absolutely, because that fleet will have to disengage. It's either going to lose the combat or disengage. But overall, the battleships are not massively disadvantaged against these corvettes. Okay, so how did the carrier battleship do against our corvettes? Well, the carrier battleship group had overwhelming victories against both types of corvette swarms. Actually, against the torpedo corvettes, the carrier battleship designs completely annihilated them and took no losses. They didn't take a single loss in any test run I did. And it's important to note here with these numbers, this isn't a single run. I did around 5 test runs of each specific data point, so I could get an average and make sure I was seeing a trend and not just a statistical fluctuation. In comparison though, the gunboat corvettes did manage to cause a small number of casualties in the battleships, the carrier battleships, when the engagement went to the end. However, as soon as the carriers had a war doctrine and the admiral, their disengage meant that those casualties completely disappeared. So as long as you've got the hit and run policy and a trickster admiral, you should basically not be taking any losses to corvettes from your carriers if you're having forces of equal size. How did the line battleship do? Well, I wasn't expecting much from this battleship design, I have to be honest, and to be quite frank, I wasn't disappointed. Now, this ship design did win its engagements against the corvettes in the entirety. However, they didn't inflict as many losses as the carrier group did, and they actually received damage consistently even before they had the option of retreating. So overall, if you're coming up against carriers, this line battleship design is definitely not one you want to go for. It's not one that you're going to be going with. Now, could this design be useful against other battleships? I don't know, I haven't tested it, though I have heard whispers about using it, a design like this, to sit at the edge of a system to try and trap somebody as they jump in close range combat. Before we move on, I'm actually just going to quickly dive in and look at which of 2 battleship designs is the best against each other here. So we've got our artillery battleships and our carrier battleships. Now, if they engage each other, which is best? Let's have a look. Well, when they engage, I never had the option of retreating with my carrier battleship fleet, because the engagement was over before that point, and it was an overwhelming victory to the artillery battleships every time. Now, why is that? Well, that is because the carrier fleet will be sending off their fighters quite soon when the combat begins, but the artillery battleships will be shooting before those fighters even arrive. So the artillery battleship is going to get an alpha strike in, and that alpha strike is going to take out quite a few of the carrier battleships, at which point the carriers, the fighters will start engaging, but they're not going to be dealing the kind of damage to alpha strike to respond to these artillery battleships in the same way. So overall, as you can see from the data, artillery battleships will beat carrier battleships in a straight up fight. It's important to note I haven't done anything here like screening with a few Corvettes in front. I haven't thrown a few Corvettes into these fleets either, which is something you might want to do in a multiplayer setting or even in a single player setting, just to maximize the efficiency of your forces. But overall, artillery battleships beat carrier battleships. If you've been enjoying this video and other videos on my channel, please consider subscribing. It will help get my videos out to other players like you. So we've seen that carrier battleships completely eviscerate Corvette swarms, and we've also seen that artillery battleships can deal quite a bit of damage, but do end up losing and having to retreat. What if we mixed our carrier battleships and our artillery battleships into a single fleet? We know that in a battleship against battleship engagement, the artillery battleships are going to prevail over the carriers, so we want to maximize the number of artillery battleships we have in this fleet, whilst also being able to deal with a Corvette swarm if we come across it. Well, the first mix that has some success at defeating Corvette swarms is 20% carriers, 80% artillery battleships. Now, that fleet will win its engagements around 50 to 60% of the time. However, it will lose and be forced to retreat on occasion. It does, looking at the data, deal massive damage to the Corvette swarms, but it's not a reliable way of staying and winning the engagement. So let's go up one more. We'll go from 20 to 30% disposition carriers against 70% artillery. Now, this is the first kind of level at which your battleship fleet is going to be able to consistently 100% of the time defeat a Corvette swarm. And that's not just torpedo Corvettes, that's also gunboat Corvettes. And you're going to take some losses with your battleship fleet, absolutely, but we're looking here at losses in the region of around 10%, 5 to 10%. Whereas, you know, at 20% carriers, you're going to be taking losses of 30 to 40% in the full end of the engagement. And you're also going to be dealing around 70 to 80% losses to the Corvette swarm. So 30% carriers to 70% battleships, that's really the fleet disposition you want to have in order to best deal with Corvettes, but also have some ability to fight and win against other battleship fleets. So one final thing I'm going to look at is what happens if we add a Titan with plus 10 tracking into our artillery fleet. So I've taken out the correct number of battleships and I've replaced it with a Titan with this tracking module on it, which is going to give plus 10 tracking across the fleet. Well, against the torpedo Corvettes and the gunboat Corvettes, but let's look at the torpedo Corvettes, the artillery battleships and a Titan still lost their engagements. But when they lost these engagements, they did phenomenal amounts of damage to the enemy fleets in return. We're talking 2-to-1 damage ratios, whereas before we were looking at sometimes only dealing equal damage with these artillery battleships. Now, if you were to disengage early, you're going to be doing somewhere in the region of 35% casualties to the Corvette swarm, but only taking around 5 to 10% casualties for yourself if you've got the War Doctrine and the Admiral. So actually, against Corvette hordes, you could also try throwing in a Titan. Now, why might this be not such a great idea? Well, Titans have a massive range to their weapon, which means the engagement range of a Titan is very large. So if you've got multiple fleets stacked in the same system and only one fleet has a Titan, well, the fleet with a Titan is going to engage first and your other fleets aren't going to engage until later on, unless you're actually watching and making sure that those fleets are set to engage whichever enemy have shown up in the system. You could end up in a situation where the Titan gets baited out, the Titan fleet, and has to engage, gets defeated, and then your other fleets still haven't even engaged yet, which is really not an ideal situation. So it's definitely something you have to micro a little bit and watch out for if you're going to mix Titans in with your battleship fleets. So, Corvettes versus battleships. Battleships versus Corvettes. Which is best? Well, the data clearly supports the conclusion that battleships are the better ship. Battleships will consistently deal more damage to Corvettes, causing a higher proportional loss of the fleet than the Corvettes will deal to the battleships. In specific cases, so against artillery battleships, which are, I must admit, the mainstay of a late game fleet, you're going to find that the battleships will lose the engagement to the Corvettes. However, they may lose the engagement, but they should deal more damage to these Corvettes. Having said that, if you're going to run with Corvettes as well, you should run the torpedo Corvettes. They're going to consistently be better performers than your gunboat or interceptor style Corvettes. And if you want to mix your battleship fleets, you should throw in about 30% carrier battleships to 70% artillery battleships. That's the best mix to be guaranteed to deal with any Corvette swarms, whilst keeping the highest proportion of artillery battleships to deal with our other artillery battleship groups. And that wraps it up for this video. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a like. If you have any feedback, please leave a comment. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe. In addition, if you'd like to support this channel, there's a link to Patreon down below in the description.